Tonight's presentation is titled Fortunate Catch, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's an author for numerous aviation publications, certified flight instructor certificate holder, A&P mechanic certificate holder, IA privileges, 2008's FAA Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, and a member of EAA. Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Well, good evening, Tim. Good evening, everybody. And I would not have let you skip past that aircraft spruce slide. That's very important. There are some weeks that I feel like I am solely responsible for keeping them in business, but not this week. Any case, tonight I want to tell you two stories. One that had a happy ending, one that had a not so happy ending, but both that were very closely related. And I'll start with the one that had a happy ending. Involves an aircraft owner named Corey, who owns a beautiful 1978 Bonanza 836. Very maintenance involved guy, does his own oil changes, owns his own bore scope. Very, very comfortable working on his airplane, although he's not an A&P mechanic. And during his most recent bore scope inspection, he identified a couple of valves that weren't looking very healthy, a couple of exhaust valves that looked like they were burning. And they seemed to be a little bit beyond the point where he thought that they could be rescued by lapping in place. So he talked to his A&P, who took a look at the valves through Corey's bore scope, and between the two of them, they decided that the cylinder that wasn't in terrible shape, they were going to send out for repair to have to be revalved. And the other one, which looked like it was in considerably worse shape, they decided that they were going to replace it with a new Superior Millennium cylinder. So the shop ordered the new cylinder, sent the other one out for repair. They both came in. The shop installed both of the cylinders, the new one and the overhauled one, and had the plane almost buttoned up when Corey stopped by to check on their progress. And it was a good thing he stopped by, because when he did, he went over, took a look at his new cylinders, and he saw red. It wasn't quite as obvious as the red on this slide. Here's actually what he saw. At the base of the new Millennium cylinder, he saw a little red stain. And on the edge of the cylinder base flange, and on the other cylinder that had gone out for repair and it was installed, he saw something similar. This was very subtle, as you can see from the picture, and it was small enough and non-obvious enough that most owners, I suspect, wouldn't have caught it. But Corey's a pretty sharp guy, and very, like I said, very, very maintenance oriented. And something told him that red was probably high temperature RTV, room temperature vulcanizing silicone rubber. Same sort of stuff that's used as bathtub caulk, but when it's used in engine compartment, it's they use a high temperature version. It's normally colored red and is designed to take high temperatures. But a little voice inside Corey's head was telling him that red RGB should not be on his cylinder base flange. And he couldn't quite place it, but he had a vague recollection that he saw one of my webinars or read one of my articles or something a while back, indicating that the use of RTV or other sealants during cylinder installation is a serious no-no. But but he wasn't 100% sure, and he didn't want to make a big fuss with his mechanic unless he was quite confident that it was a problem. So fortunately, he's one of our maintenance consulting clients. He subscribes to our consulting service called Savvy QA. So he posted a question, opened a trouble ticket on the Savvy system, and put a picture of what he saw and asked whether we thought it was a problem. And his ticket was responded to by my technical director, Jeff Eskirka, who's a very, very experienced PIA, who said, yeah, this is a significant problem. And he referred him to a particular page in Continental's standard practices manual, manual M0, in which there was a big warning in boldface and all caps and stuff that says that the use of RTV, something called gasket maker, which is a Continental product, or any other sealant during cylinder installation is a very, very serious problem, and that it can cause catastrophic engine failure. And it says that when you're installing a cylinder, the only thing that should be on those surfaces is clean 50 weight engine oil and nothing else. It doesn't say it explicitly, I don't think, but even the presence of some paint on the cylinder base flange or the cylinder deck area of the crankcase where the base flange mounts can cause catastrophic engine failure. It's a very serious problem. Big warning in the manual. So armed with that, Corey went to the director of maintenance at his shop, said, I've seen some red stuff that looks like it might be RTV, and the manual makes a big issue that you shouldn't use anything like that. The director of maintenance took a look, saw what Corey saw, admitted that his mechanic had made a serious mistake, and that the shop would agree to remove the cylinders and correct the problem. They did, and once the cylinders were removed, Corey was absolutely shocked at how much RTV was present in the on the mounting deck area where the cylinder was attached. Here's a close-up picture of it. You could see that there's RTV everywhere. This cylinder would have definitely departed the engine. The only question is whether it would have taken 20 hours or 200 hours. It's a little unpredictable. But this would have really been a catastrophic thing if Corey had not blown the whistle on it. So the mechanic who actually installed the cylinders admitted that he had applied a little dab of RTV to the cylinder base O-ring, the cylinder base seal, in hopes that it would help make sure that the cylinder wouldn't have an oil leak. But of course, once he installed the cylinder and torqued down all of the hold-down nuts, that little dab of RTV that he put on the base O-ring extruded all throughout the entire cylinder mounting base area, and turned what was supposed to be a hard joint, metal on metal, torqued down with a whole lot of torque, into a soft joint that would have eventually caused some of those hold down studs or through bolts or both to fatigue fracture in flight and lead to a cylinder separation. So Corey made sure that every scrap of that RTV was removed. It was a lot of work to take it off, as you can imagine, a lot of scrubbing, and that the base flange and the cylinder deck were completely clean of any any RTV residue before the cylinder was installed. Now, Corey had a pretty good memory. It turns out that his recollection about this was based on an article that I wrote for Sport Aviation. It was actually in the April 2013 issue of Sport Aviation. So it's something that he had seen about 10 years before, apparently, but remembered. The article was titled "A Little Dabble Do You In." It's sort of a pun on the old Brill Cream commercial, which many of you probably aren't old enough to remember. But in any case, the article, and I also did a companion webinar, described a catastrophic in-flight engine failure and the subsequent crash of an airplane that was uncomfortably similar to Corey's airplane. It actually was a 1966 Beech Debonair, which crashed near Salinas, California, not all that far away from where I live. The airplane had a catastrophic engine failure. One of the cylinders, I think it was the number 4 cylinder, departed the engine in flight. The pilot tried to make it to Salinas Airport. Couldn't quite make it because one of the cowling doors blew open because when the cylinder departed the engine. And he wound up making a forced landing in a vineyard, as you can see. And unfortunately, the forced landing was at right angles to the vineyard road, so the airplane stopped rather suddenly when it hit all those wires. The pilot in command was 32 years old. He was a flight instructor. His passenger was 44. Both occupants suffered serious injuries in the crash. The passenger suffered the worst injuries. He actually had a traumatic brain injury that was permanently incapacitating. So it was a very sad accident. This is where the number 4 cylinder used to be, but it came off. A couple of the studs had the retaining nuts backed off. The other studs and the through bolts fractured, fatigue fractured. The cylinder departed the premises. The piston and connecting rod departed the engine once the cylinder was removed. Two of the hold down nuts were found in the bottom of the cowling, and the remaining 4 studs and the 2 through bolts were sheared off, as you could see in the picture. The number 4 connecting rod, cap, bolts, nuts were all recovered from the bottom of the engine cowling, as was most of the sheared off portions of the studs. So most of it wound up in the bottom of the cowling. Although the piston itself departed and was never found, and the cylinder itself was never found. They flew off in flight. So, of course, the NTSB investigated this accident, and they came out a year or so later with a probable cause report. The probable cause indicated that the probable cause of the accident was the installing mechanic's failure to torque the hold-down nuts properly. It's easy to see how they came to that conclusion, but it turned out the NTSB was wrong about the cause of the accident. And in my experience, it's not all that uncommon for the NTSB to be wrong, particularly when they investigate general aviation accidents. And we found out that the NTSB was wrong some years later, because, as frequently happens in cases like this where there's serious injury or death, there was a lawsuit. The passenger who had traumatic brain injury brought suit against everybody. The pilot, the aircraft owner, the shop that did the maintenance, Continental Motors, everybody that he could think of were defendants in this lawsuit, as is typically the case. And in reviewing the Oh, and I should mention, it's not on the slide here, but the plaintiff, this severely injured passenger, hired a really, really good aviation attorney, somebody that I've had some dealings with in the past. And it's a really excellent attorney, and he happens to be an aircraft owner and a pilot himself, and is very, very knowledgeable. A fellow by the name of Mike Danko. And in reviewing the photographs that the NDSB had taken during its examination many years before the lawsuit finally got into discovery, Danko, the plaintiff's attorney, discovered something very crucial that were right in the photographs that the NTSB took at the time, but that the NTSB investigators missed seeing the significance of. And these are the photos. These were NTSB photos, and you can see on the cylinder deck area some brown stuff. It's pretty clear, particularly in the left-hand photo, is a big thick patch of this brown stuff. And the brown stuff was a sealant. It wasn't RTV. It was a different sealant, but it was a sealant that was on the mounting deck. They found some evidence of it on the mounting decks below 4 cylinders, number 2, 4, 5, and 6, all of which had been removed and replaced during the most recent annual inspection of this airplane. So in discovery, the further investigation was done. And it turns out that about a week before this Debonair went in for its annual inspection, the shop that maintained the Debonair hosted a Beechcraft service clinic at which, among other things, a Continental Motors rep was present. And during the service clinic, a young mechanic who turned out to be the one that actually installed the cylinders on the Debonair got into a conversation with the Continental Motors rep, and the Continental Motors rep was touting this new sealant that Continental had just come out called Gasket Maker, and was saying how useful this stuff was and how good it was at sealing oil leaks. And so this young mechanic decided he was going to get a tube of this stuff and put it in his toolbox, and sort of started looking for places that he might be able to use this new product. At trial, a mechanic who installed the cylinders, it was actually, he was an apprentice mechanic. He was working on his A&P, but he wasn't yet an A&P. He was working as an apprentice in the shop under supervision. But he did admit to applying a Continental Gasket Maker to the cylinder base seals when he installed those 4 cylinders. And he testified at trial that the Continental tech rep, who was at the Beach Service Clinic, had been touting this gasket maker as the best thing since sliced bread. And he said when the mechanic asked, where do you use this stuff? He said, well, any place you could have an oil leak. So that got the mechanic thinking, well, he's going to install 4 cylinders on this Debonair. I wonder if I should use Gasket Maker on these cylinders. He wasn't sure, so he consulted with his supervisor, who was a very experienced IA, but the IA wasn't really familiar with this Gasket Maker because it was a brand new product. So he said, well, maybe we should research it a little bit. So they did. They looked at Continental's guidance on Gasket Maker, and the Continental's written guidance on Gasket Maker said it was approved for all uncoated oil seals. Then they looked in the IO 520 parts manual, and the parts manual listed the cylinder base seal. We normally refer to it as an O-ring, but they call it the cylinder base seal, as an oil seal. They said it, and it's an O-ring. It was obviously an uncoated oil seal. And since Continental guidance said gasket maker was approved for use on all uncoated oil seals, the supervising IA said to the young mechanic, "Well, I guess it's okay to use on the cylinder base O-ring then." So the mechanic went ahead and put a little dab of this brown stuff on the cylinder base O-rings when he hung the cylinders, and of course the same thing happened when he torqued down the cylinders. The gasket maker extruded out between the base flange and the cylinder deck, and it was kind of all over the place and showed up in those NTSB photos after the crash. So this was a jury trial, and later in the trial, Continental's expert was on the stand, and Danko cross-examined him, and the Continental expert admitted on the stand that Continental knew of other incidents where their engines came apart in flight because mechanics had applied gasket maker to the cylinder base O-rings, and yet they had not revised their manuals to make it clear that this was not an acceptable use for the product. And as a result of that, the Danko convinced the jury that Continental was at least partially liable for this crash due to failure to warn of the hazard of using this gasket maker stuff. And the jury, in its infinite wisdom, awarded the plaintiff $15 million in damages. All of the plaintiffs were jointly and severally liable for the $15 million, but the only one that had more than about $1 million worth of insurance was Continental. So Continental wound up picking up most of the tab of this $15 million award. And as a result of that, Continental decided they better revise their manuals, and that's where this big warning took place. But this all happened more than 10 years ago. And I found it pretty astonishing that more than a decade after all this happened and Continental amended their manuals, originally it was in service bulletins, and then it was incorporated into Manual M0. And that more than a decade after that happened, mechanics in the field are still making the same crucial mistake that can cause cylinders to depart engines in flight, and obviously cause pretty serious consequences. 30 years ago, before I was an A&P, I was just a maintenance-involved aircraft owner like Corey. My A&P mentors taught me about the fact that that anything that comes between the cylinder base flange and the crankcase deck area where it mounts, even a layer of paint or anything at all, can result in cylinder separation. And I assumed that every A&P knew about this, but obviously that assumption is not correct. And it was a darn good thing that Corey remembered this, and that he was observant enough to notice those subtle traces of red stuff, which I think most owners would have missed, and recognize what it was. His experience in Corey's story demonstrates something that I've been preaching for years and wrote about in the last chapter of my first book, Manifesto, that the last line of defense against maintenance-induced failure is an observant and maintenance-aware aircraft owner like Corey. So, Tim, those are my two stories for tonight, and I'd be happy to open it up for some Q&A.
All right, Mike. Question from Wendy wondering, do Lycoming cylinders have the same problem if they're installed with the gasket maker?
Absolutely. I don't know that Lycoming has ever been sued over it, and I'm not sure that they have as profound a warning in their manuals, but exactly the same issue would apply to Lycomings. This is not continental specific. This just simply has to do with the fact that these fasteners, these hold down studs and through bolts, are subject to a great deal of torque because the cylinder is under a great deal of stress. It's every time there's a combustion event, that cylinder is trying to pull itself off the crankcase. And so the combined preload on all of those fasteners, both Continental and Lycoming use eight fasteners for most of their cylinders, 6 studs that thread into the crankcase and 2 through bolts that go all the way through the case. But the combined preload on all of those fasteners has to be great enough that even the maximum combustion related stress that occurs on those cylinders is not enough to cause the joint to move. Because if the joint could move, then with the engine running and hundreds of thousands of these events, the fasteners will fail in fatigue. The only thing that prevents them from failing in fatigue is for the preload on those fasteners to be great enough that the joint can't move. Well, if you put anything soft in between the cylinder base flange and the deck, that what's supposed to be a hard joint becomes a soft joint, and it obviously can move because the sealant is flexible. And even if the sealant weren't flexible, say something like paint, the fact that whatever that substance is between the cylinder deck and the flange, if it could wear away over time, that would relieve a significant amount of the preload on the studs and the through bolts. When I talk about preload, I'm talking about the amount that those fasteners are stretched when the nuts are torqued down, and it's critical that those things be torqued to achieve sufficient preload, and that preload remain constant throughout the life of the cylinder being attached to the engine. And anything that can cause the preload to be lessened or that can cause the joint to become soft will result in ultimately failure of those fasteners. And again, like I say, it could be 20 hours, could be 200 hours, a little hard to predict. But almost certainly Corey cylinders would have departed the engine after some period of time because of the RTV that was applied. And the amount of RTV that was applied on Corey's cylinders looked like it was a lot more than what was on the Debonair, whose cylinder departed the premises. RTV is worse really than gasket maker, but both of them are pretty bad.
Neil wonders, would not the O-ring seal, oil seal, be soft?
The O-ring sits in a chamfer. It doesn't sit between the base flange and the cylinder deck. It sits in a little 45-degree chamfer in the case, and it does not cause the joint to be soft. It does not interpose itself between the cylinder base flange and the deck portion of the crankcase.
Chris wonders, would 50 weight oil have the same effect?
No, the 50 weight oil would basically be just squeezed out of there. There wouldn't be any of it left after the cylinders were torqued down.
Wendy wonders, do cylinder nuts have lock washers to keep them from unscrewing?
They do not, and there's not a need for them. As long as the joint is torqued sufficiently so that nothing can move, there really isn't anything that could cause the nut to be dislodged. And cylinder hold down nuts do not have lock washers. They don't have safety wires. The only thing that keeps them in place is a great deal of torque.
Stephen wonders, could a few thousandths thickness of paint start a fatigue cycle?
Yes, it could, because the paint will disintegrate over time and relieve the torque on the through bolts. Now, whether that's enough to cause separation really would depend on the thickness of the paint film. But it would, any paint film, because it will deteriorate under the repetitive stress of hundreds of thousands of combustion events going on, will certainly reduce the amount of preload on those fasteners. And whether it reduces it enough to cause them to fatigue fracture is really a question of how thick the paint film is. If it was maybe just a little overspray from a spray can, maybe you could get away with it. It's hard to say. But the only really safe thing to do is to make sure that those mating surfaces are scrupulously clean.
Charles says, my aircraft had the beginning of a cylinder separation, and when the engine was overhauled, sealant was found between the crankcase halves. I thought that the proper gasket for a Lycoming was a silk thread. The mechanic doing the overhaul agreed with me. Is this the same as sealant on the cylinder's mounting?
It's not as serious a problem, but it is this. The principle is the same. The case parting surfaces are supposed to be sealed with silk thread. You do apply a thin layer of stuff that's slightly sticky to one side of it, so that the thread will adhere and stay in place as you're bolting the case together. But it's an extremely thin layer of liquid that gets brushed on, and the manufacturers are extremely picky about what you use. You're not supposed to use anything soft or anything that is compressible. But yes, the silk thread, it is kind of interesting after all these years that there isn't something more high tech, but but yes, the silk thread is what's used to seal the case halves, and there's a fairly complex diagram that shows exactly how the thread is to be applied and exactly where the thread is to be applied.
Fran wonders, when torquing the cylinder nuts, are they dry or wet?
They have to be saturated with oil. The torque specification is definitely a wet torque, and if a common mistake in installing cylinders is to not use sufficient lubrication on those fasteners, and as a result, more of the torque that is applied is dispersed overcoming friction, and less of it is actually accomplishes the preload, which is what the whole tightening of the nuts is all about. And I actually did a whole webinar on the physics of joints and got into a lot of detail about this stuff. But yeah, it's very important that the fasteners be very well oiled before the nuts are torqued down. That's one of the many things you can screw up when you're installing a cylinder. It's one of the reasons I don't like pulling cylinders off, because a cylinder installation is very, very critical, very safety critical, and there's an awful lot of ways to screw it up.
Andrew asks, first he says, that was an extremely lucky catch that you said most owners would have missed. This
Sure.
seems like a weak safety net. Are there any other ways we as owners can ensure that work on our aircraft has been done correctly?
I mean, really, the only way is to do what Corey did, which is be very observant, and be an information junkie, which aircraft owners tend to be more information junkie people than mechanics tend to, as a general rule. It's hard to make generalizations about that, but you know, there owners just tend to soak up as much information as they can, mechanics, as a rule, aren't aren't don't have that orientation. Although some do. I mean, there's some fantastic mechanics out there, but there are also some very scary ones. And the quality of general aviation maintenance is highly variable, let's say. And there's some of it is downright scary.
Attending this webinar and other webinars that you do and reading your books is a great way to educate yourself to learn about these things. Wouldn't you agree, Mike?
Well, I try.
Plug yourself. Give yourself a good plug there.
I appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah.
I,
All right.
I do think it's really, really important for aircraft owners to be involved in the maintenance of the aircraft. And I always applaud somebody like Corey, who, you know, does its own oil changes and its own bore scope inspections and stuff, because it means he's, you know, he's really interested. And that's not true of you know, every aircraft owner. An awful lot of aircraft owners who are, you know, more appliance operators. They want to fly the airplane, but they figure the maintenance is somebody else's responsibility, and it's really not somebody else's responsibility under the regulations. We as aircraft owners have primary responsibility for the airworthiness of our aircraft, but more than that, it's, you know, like I say, the owner is really the last line of defense. And when the airplane falls out of the sky, it's usually not the mechanic that's getting hurt. I mean, he may get in trouble as a result, but he's probably going to be able to walk away from it. So you know, we as aircraft owners are highly motivated, because it's usually, you know, our rear ends that are on the line.
George wondered, at factory overhaul, is the engine case and cylinder base leveled with a surface grinder so they're exactly mating?
Oh yeah, the part of every engine overhaul is um, the case is sent out to one of a fairly small number of shops in the country capable of line boring everything and making sure everything is in perfect alignment. And one part of that is that both case halves have their mating surfaces machined perfectly flat and perfectly smooth. And the process of doing that takes a little bit of metal away, and so then all of um, the places where the camshaft goes and the bearings go and so on have to be what's called line board, or in order to restore everything to its proper dimensions. But yeah, that's definitely done at every major overhaul, is to recondition the crankcase half so that, among other things, the mating surfaces are perfectly flat.
Yuli wonders, does it make sense to check torque on those fasteners? Would it catch the problem? Is it easy or even possible to do it on a regular practice?
Um, well, it's not a terrible idea to put a wrench on the cylinder hold down fasteners that are readily accessible. Typically, in most engine installations, it's fairly easy to get a wrench on some of those nuts, and other of those nuts, it's very difficult to get access without taking lots of baffles and stuff off. But it's not a bad idea to to check the torque on the fasteners that are relatively easy to get to. Um, but having said that, um, when you check the torque after the fact, you're checking what's called breakaway torque. You basically, putting the the torque wrench on it and seeing if it clicks without anything moving. Um, and that's not really quite the same as running torque. The breakaway torque tends to be higher torque, so it, it's not the same as untorquing the fastener, lubricating it, and then retorquing it to spec. But at the same time, it's not a bad idea, because if a fastener has lost a significant amount of torque, you might catch it that way. But again, when you're doing that, you're checking the torque dry rather than wet, which makes a huge difference. And you're really checking breakaway torque rather than running torque, which is really what the spec is talking about. The running torque is the torque that's applied when the nut's actually moving. Breakaway torque is when you're checking it in a sort of a static condition, and hopefully it doesn't move. And the two are quite different.
Derek wonders, was there any concern that there may have been other aircraft with the same cylinder issues at that shop, or was this the only one confirmed?
That's a pretty good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Hmm.
The only one I knew about was Corey, and I complimented him, said, "Good job."
Mm-hmm. No doubt. Neil wonders, is there any other sort of visual inspection that an owner could do when doing pre-flight?
um, well, I mean, really, you should look at everything you can, and unfortunately, the Bonanza is kind of an exception, because it's got those big barn doors. You actually can see quite a lot of stuff at pre-flight with a Bonanza, because it has such wonderful access with those big cowling doors that open. Most aircraft aren't like that, and a lot of particularly modern aircraft, Cirruses and Diamonds and stuff like that, you basically can see hardly anything during pre-flight, which is one of the reasons I really like to see owners do their own oil changes, because it gives them a chance to actually remove the cowlings and actually lay eyeballs on the thing in a serious way, which is something on most aircraft you can't really do at pre-flight.
Chris wonders, will an improperly sealed cylinder show up on oil analysis?
No, no, it wouldn't.
John?
There would really be no way of there would typically be no warning signs. That there certainly have been cases that I've seen where somebody um, is looking at the engine and discovers that one or two of the cylinder hold down nuts are gone or are cracked or something like that, which is very lucky if you can catch it at that point,
Mhm.
because that cylinder was on its way to separating, and somebody luckily caught it in time. But it's often very hard to catch that sort of thing before it becomes catastrophic.
Yeah, Martin asks, is there any instrumentation, vibration sensors, or anything that could have warned the owner?
Probably not. I, I'm the only engine monitors that I'm aware of that actually have any sort of vibration analysis or the Insight G series engine monitors, and whether those would be useful in detecting something like this before the ultimate failure is something I really don't know. I really don't have any experience with those things.
John wonders, what about using torque seal on the case halves and cylinders?
Well, it's a good practice to use torque seal, which is kind of a frangible putty that you put on a nut after you've torqued it down. And the idea is that if the nut starts to back off, it will fracture the torque seal and it will become more visually obvious during a visual inspection that the nut has moved. But the nut doesn't necessarily have to move. You know, in the case of the Debonair that crashed, where we have a lot of information because it was analyzed by the NTSB. Two of the nuts backed off. The rest of them didn't move. The fastener simply fractured and sheared off. So it's not necessary for nuts to move for a cylinder separation to happen. It sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. You know, again, the thing that's preventing the nut from backing off is the preload. So if the preload is relieved, sometimes the nut will back off. But sometimes it won't. Usually what'll happen, which happened in the case of the Bonanza, is maybe one or two back off, and then the remaining fasteners are taking more than the share of the load that they were designed to take, and they'll fail in overstress.
Vic wonders, is it okay to use never sees on the nuts?
I'm not familiar with never sees. The both Continental and Lycoming have specific recommendations in terms of what you're supposed to lubricate the fasteners with before you torque them. Continental wants you to lubricate them with ordinary 50 weight engine oil. Lycoming wants you to lubricate them with a mixture, which I believe is 90% engine oil and 10% STP, the Andy Granatelli stuff. I didn't know you could even still get that, which is a friction modifier. And there are some purpose-made fastener lubricants that are designed for race cars and stuff like that, and they would probably work well for aircraft, but they're not approved by either manufacturer. So you'd sort of be a test pilot if you used them on when installing a cylinder.
Michael asks, if one cylinder hold down nut requires replacing, should the other nuts be backed off so you can do a total sequence procedure?
Um, well, I'm not sure why the one nut would need replacing. If it needed replacing for some static reason, like it was corroded or something like that, it probably wouldn't need to mess with the other nuts. But if it had to be replaced because it was backing off and the torque seal was broken, then it probably would be a good idea to torque relieve the nuts and then go through the lubricate everything and then go through the full torquing sequence. There's a very specific sequence that you're supposed to use when you torque cylinders down. you torque down the nuts to half of their final torque in a particular sequence, and then you go and torque them to their final torque in a particular sequence after they've all been torqued down to half their final torque.
I think you already touched on this, but maybe reviewing it again, Santosh's question. Why does RTV or any other sealant cause the cylinder to part the engine?
Because it doesn't, it prevents a firm metal to metal contact in the joint, and it causes the joint to be a soft joint that can move rather than a hard joint that can't move. And it's absolutely essential that it be a hard joint, otherwise the fasteners will fatigue fracture.
Todd wonders, is there generally a leak using the proper O-ring?
No, very seldom. Very seldom the cylinders leak. I mean, they can if the O-ring got twisted or something during installation, but no, it's the cylinder-based leaks are not that common a problem when the cylinder is installed properly.
Mark wonders, in-flight fluctuation of oil pressure, could that be an early warning sign?
Well, it can be an early warning sign of something else. It could be an early warning sign of say, a displaced main bearing or something like that. It wouldn't be an early warning sign of a cylinder coming off. But it would be a very bad thing, and if it happens, you should land the airplane.
Leaf wonders, would the mechanic have any blame in the second story for the accident? And who would be responsible, the representative or the Continental mechanic?
Oh, they all were responsible. The jury allocated blame in percentages to all of the various participants, including the pilot in command, by the way, on the basis that he made his forced landing in a way that did not minimize the damage to the plane or its occupants by landing in a vineyard at right angles to the rows of grapes. But no, I mean, this is typically the case. Everybody who could conceivably be a plaintiff was conceivably be a defendant in the case was, and the jury allocated blame by percentage. But under the law, other than punitive damages, the various defendants were jointly and severally liable for the award, and so the actual allocation of money was really who had the best insurance, and Continental had a lot more insurance than the shop did, and then the pilot did. So Continental wound up with the greatest part of the burden. That may not be fair, but it's just the way the legal system seems to work. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really get too deep into that subject. I just get a chance to watch a lot of lawyers ply their trade.
Carlos wonders, how come hold down cylinder nuts are not safety wired to avoid coming loose?
Because, well, first of all, they don't need to be. If they're properly torqued, they're not going to come loose. And second of all, if they were going to start coming loose, safety wire isn't strong enough to prevent it from happening. These fasteners are very, very high stress fasteners that are subject to a tremendous amount of torque, particularly the through bolts.
James says, it seems like there's no way to check for this condition, and you have to just deal with the chance that your engine was put together wrong and it could fail. Is that correct?
I'm inclined to agree with that analysis, yes. Now, having said that, it's very rare for a problem like this to occur on a cylinder that was installed at an engine shop or at the factory, because those guys do that stuff every day of the week and they know what they're doing. Typically, the problem occurs when cylinders are installed in the field, because those mechanics are not professional engine builders, and they're much more inclined to make a mistake.
Ken wonders, do you recommend checking the engine through bolt torque on a pre-purchase inspection? And what do you recommend doing if the torque is low?
That's not the kind of thing that is typically done during a pre-buy, or for that matter during an annual inspection. And if the torque was low and I was the buyer, I would tell a seller that he was going to need to drop his price enough that I could have the engine undergo a teardown inspection, because that's what Continental or Lycoming would recommend if you ask them. Now, that's not to say I would necessarily do that, but if I was the buyer of the aircraft under those circumstances, I would certainly want the seller to reduce his price enough to fund doing that.
Steven says, in regards to cylinder separation problems, how are through bolts installed? Is it during the case mating process or after that?
They are installed obviously as the engine is being put together, and if I'm not mistaken, the through bolts are all installed through both case halves before the case spine bolts are torqued to their final torque. But I'm not an engine builder. I can't absolutely swear to that.
Donald says he thinks that he's heard that Continental has increased the torque on through case studs. Were these failures prior to the correct torque spec?
No, first of all, the torque increase was not on the studs, but it was on the through bolts. The Continental has increased the torque on the through bolts a couple of times over the years. And the most recent increase, which wasn't all that recent, the torque got so high, something like 800 inch-pounds if memory serves, that the 6-point nuts that were used on through bolts were no longer capable of being torqued to that torque spec without rounding off the corners of the nuts. So they went to 12-point nuts. And if we looked at the picture, let me see if I can find that for you real quick. But if we looked at the photograph of Corey's engine, where is that? Here it is. Oh no, that's after the cylinder came off. Let me find the right one for you. Sorry about that. Here's the one. The nut on the through bolt in that silver colored cylinder, which is the new cylinder, the one that has a little red stain on it, you can see that that's a 16 or a 12-point nut. That's a through bolt nut. The nut to the left of it on the other cylinder is a 6-point nut. That's a nut on one of the hold down studs. The torque spec increase that Continental did, and I think they did two rounds of torque increases on their through bolts. involved the through bolts and ultimately involved changing from the conventional 6-point nuts to these 12-point nuts that you can put more torque on before the nut starts to round off. So we know for sure on Corey's engine that the new style nut and the higher torque spec was used. The Debonair, that was 10 years ago. I don't know. And I'm not sure any of the NTSB pictures would show that because the cylinder had separated, so we probably aren't going to see any nuts on the Bonanza.
George was wondering on the
This
left
is
nut.
the Bonanza, yeah. But there are no nuts here just to look at, so we can't really tell.
Mhm. Going back to the old picture, or the previous picture, I'm sorry. George was wondering on,
This one here?
yes, the
Okay.
6-point nut, 6 faces. What's the glob of, what's the
That's torque
stuff
seal.
on that nut?
That's torque seal.
Okay.
And you can also see that the torque seal was not applied to the nuts on the new cylinder. So it looks to me like the torque seal on that nut on the left-hand cylinder was applied either at the Continental factory or at the overhaul shop where the engine was built. And again, that's sort of an example of the fact that the professional engine builders tend to have a routine that they go through, and they're more conscientious about this stuff. And in the field, it's highly variable what the skill of the mechanic is in terms of doing something like this. Makes me more nervous when it's done in the field. Let's put it that way.
Well, you've done total webinars on cylinder removal and how critical of an operation it is, haven't you?
Yep. Yeah, I actually had to replace a cylinder on one of my engines shortly before AirVenture, and it was it's not something I like to do, but in this particular case, it was necessary. And it took an awful lot of care in putting that cylinder back together. Triple checked everything. Makes me nervous.
Chris says, is that torque putty on the adjacent cylinder? I know we called it torque seal, but is there such a
Yeah,
thing as torque putty?
yeah, there's synonyms. Torque seal, I think, is the brand name.
Same stuff, just different name.
Yeah, yeah.
Chris follows up, is there any consequence to mixing 6 and 12 surface nuts?
Well, I'm not sure what's meant by that, but the 12-point nuts are used only on the through bolts, and if you use them, which you should use if you're using the new torque spec, you'd need to use a 12-point nut on both ends of that particular through bolt. But it is, there are cases of engines where some of the through bolts have 6-point nuts and some have 12-point nuts because the engine was built back before the 12-point nuts were initiated, and then some cylinder work was done, and on the cylinder that were worked on, the 12-point nuts were installed and the higher torque spec was used. Continental did not try to require, when they came up with the new torque spec, they did not say that all engines needed to be retrofitted with the 12-point nuts and the higher torque. And even if they did, they wouldn't have any way of compelling owners to do that unless they convinced the FAA to issue an AD to that effect, which they did not do, certainly. So there are engines that have a mixture of 6 and 12-point nuts on the through bolts, but since that change took place quite a long time ago, nowadays most Continental engines use the 12-point nuts.
Thomas says lock washers are used in automotive and marine engines. Why aren't they used in aircraft engines?
Well, they're not necessary, and I don't think that they would tolerate the amount of torque that these fasteners are torqued to.
Hmm. Well, Mike, I think that pretty much wraps up the questions that we've had here tonight. Wrap it up a little bit early tonight. Take a moment to share closing thoughts with everybody.
Okay, usual stuff. If you're not on my email list and want to be on there, easiest way to do it is to pick up your phone and text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777, and you'll get a little automated text that asks you for your name and email address, and it'll go into our database, and you'll start getting our newsletter and so on. My books are available at the EAA bookstore, Aircraft Spruce, on Amazon. The first two books are available in audiobook format from Audible, and we're just starting work now on the audiobook version of Airplane Ownership Volume 1. Our podcast that I do with Paul New and Colleen Sterling, called Ask the A&Ps, is now on twice a month. You can find it at Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or pretty much any place that you find podcasts if you're a podcast person. We also do a video version of Ask the A&Ps that you can find on YouTube. And like I say, we just changed from once a month to twice a month because we were getting so many questions. It's basically a call-in show. So if you'd like to be our participant on the show and ask a question and try to stump us or whatever, you can email your question to our producer, Ian Twombly, at podcasts@aopa.org, and he'll schedule you for one of our recording sessions, which we tend to do around the middle of each month. It varies a little bit. And finally, my next 3 first Wednesday of the month webinars. November, I have a webinar called Miracle in Sioux Falls that has to do with a little mishap I had with my airplane on the way to AirVenture this year. And although it was an unfortunate mishap, it triggered a series of very fortuitous events that wound up getting me to AirVenture on time without being delayed, which is really a good thing. So I'll tell you about that. Just a little soul cleansing there. In December, I'm going to do a webinar called Deadly Mag Switches about the hazard involved with our conventional key operated magneto switches that seem to be in the majority of single engine airplanes, and talk to you about what the hazards are and what you can do to make sure that you don't get hurt and your airplane doesn't wind up chewing up another airplane or a car or whatever. All kinds of terrible things have happened because of these mag switches. And finally, January, the first webinar of 2024, I have a webinar that's titled Time Materials, where I'm going to be discussing the pitfalls of the way most general aviation maintenance is charged for on the basis of time and materials. Contrast it with how we do things in the automotive world, and talk about maybe some things owners can do to help themselves with regard to the cost of maintenance caused by the time material system that most GA maintenance is done on. And I think that's about it, Tim. Thanks for everybody who attended tonight, and be looking forward to seeing you next month.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Awesome presentation. And looking forward to seeing you next month, hearing about your adventure you had in Sioux Falls. So thanks for sharing.
Okay.
And yeah. And to everybody who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Good night, everybody.